And welcome into the roundtable. Bill Priestley here with you, as we've got also Thomas Wasson here to my left. And we also have Matthew Leffler, our armchair attorney that joins us from Chicago. And today we're going to talk a little bit about AB5 and what's been going on. Obviously, that's now been made law in California as the injunction was formally raised. And just what the effects that's going to be in the near term and in the long term for this as well. And Matt, let me just start with you here. AB5, the law itself was stopped via injunction. Basically, somebody said, "I don't like this. We're going to try and stop it that way." It didn't really get a chance to go through the actual court process of seeing if the law itself was going to perhaps create conditions that might not be conducive to business, so on and so forth. It just said, we don't want this. Now it gives the opportunity to go through that, but what does that case look like when it comes to the F4A law and this one basically combining?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the injunction is put in place to try to stop a big implementation that could cost tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in compliance and modifications to the existing infrastructure. Keep in mind, though, this is, again, a codification of case law, so nothing really major changes. As it relates to FAAAA, this is a really good question about what it actually applies to. So FAAA has to do with what we look at is, price and the route and the service, nothing to do with the safety aspect or the classification of employees. Classification of an independent or an employee is generally done at the state level. And so I don't believe we're going to see a lot of good tread when it comes to using FAAA as a way of looking at preemption to stop this thing.
So is this, as this possibly could go through the court case, through the courts again, does this have really little chance of stopping AB5 from really absolutely being codified into law forever?
Yeah, I'm just an armchair attorney. I am a lawyer. I don't practice in the state of California. It's going to lose. The same thing with the Commerce Clause. This is just a way to try to delay the implementation. The Supreme Court is going to look at this. If it gets up to the Supreme Court, they'll ask for a petition for certiorari, and the Supreme Court will say, no, this is an employment thing. This is a state level employment thing. Why are you coming to us with this? And so I think there might be some traction to try to push this thing, but I don't believe it's going to be able to get across the finish line. AB5 is here to stay. The ABC test is here to stay, and many states use it. It's not going to change anything in the next couple months or years.
All right. So, Thomas, let's switch gears a little bit here and talk a little bit about what this means. We've talked a lot about what it means for the owner-operator, because then obviously the independent contractor, that now gets thrown into some gray area. Now you've got to be an employee if you're going to be contracted by, let's say, a logistics or a trucking company. What does this now mean for California fleet operators that are now no longer going to be using independent contractors?
I mean, there's a few ways to somewhat get around it. Carriers are clever when it comes to the compliance department. So what I would honestly see is a lot of California companies conveniently showing their terminals in Arizona or other locations and saying, okay, well, I'm going to buy a parking spot real quick. Sure, I'm operating in another state. Why not? But, from a large carrier standpoint, large legal teams, they've got this figured out. They're going to hash out the stuff. But for these owner operators and stuff that don't have it, we may see new structures, talking about brokerages and how forwarders and how the situation is. I would totally expect just a really haphazard workaround where, oh, congratulations, you're a quasi-employee for this one broker or a forwarder, and now we're just back to business as usual with one extra layer.
Gotcha. Matt, let's look at it from that perspective as well. When we had Zach Strickland basically answering that same type of question, saying basically that HR departments and lawyers, forgive the illusion, are going to have a lot more work on their hands just because of this. What's your take on how the carrier is going to respond to how this law is going to be implemented?
That's a great question. So just to give some background, I had a logistics repair and maintenance company with over 100 employees in the state of California. We were working for the largest parcel carrier that had ever existed. And this is back in the early 90s when we started working with them. The reality is these people who've been classified as independents were never independents. They were always employees. And so this workaround of saying, how do you get to a place where you can safely operate in the state of California? That is not just having them, if they're going to be a contractor as a separate business entity, but if they do come on as employees, the wage and hour claims that they could face when it comes to meal periods or overtime will cause a lot of trucking companies a lot of heartburn. So just making someone an employee, paying their workers' compensation, paying their health insurance, paying for general liability for them, paying the unemployment insurance, that's the table stakes to get to this next level. What happens after that is, how are you stay compliant? I just think about drayage operators who are going back and forth from a warehouse to a port, and when they miss their meal period, what will the employer do? These are things that every single business that is operating in the state of California needs to call their lawyer or call the California Trucking Associations and say, I need some help because I don't want to risk losing my business because I don't understand how wage and hour claims in California work.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thomas, let me turn that question more towards you. If you're a carrier, say, for instance, if you've got, say, 30 trucks and maybe 28 of them are being used at this point, and all of a sudden you have an order that requires 6 trucks, how do you handle hiring practices when you can't get quote-unquote independent contractors that are just going to work that one job?
I mean, you may have to use it as something like an agent carrier, or try to go around other ways. I mean, we looked at the mighty Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, but also the Seventh Circuit Court, I think, out of Wisconsin. We talked about if you're truly an owner-operator and what that means. And so trucking for a long time has gotten away with it. I saw it at a large carrier myself. You're an independent owner-operator, but I'm recommending you loads. Did you really have a choice? No, you can't see the load board. You're just getting to say yes or no. And if you say no enough, you may be at a disadvantage. And so I think that's a great question. We've seen 2 Circuit Court of Appeals now making it. And if you're a large carrier, I would start coming up with an idea to make sure that maybe we need to fix our business model to such an extent that we are giving these guys meal breaks. Because right now the business model is, I'm going to let you work 70 hours a week. You're paid per mile, and you just got to figure everything else out. If you're an owner operator, it's kind of the short end of the stick.
Matt, you mentioned the initial idea, and then of course other states have some infrastructure around that could possibly see an AB5 type law come their way. Are they going to look at California and see this as maybe a cautionary tale, or something they're going to look at and see proof of concept to see how this works before perhaps they go in that direction? Or do you see perhaps maybe a more widespread adaptation of what this is across the country?
AB5 is here for everybody. Just to understand this, when it comes to classification of an employee, ABC test, that test which AB5 uses, that is in 20 different states. That's not going anywhere. But to the point on the Schneider National case, when it comes to Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, what's interesting there is that the driver was unable to work with a competitive company. He had to get approval from his bosses of the hiring entity to go do that. And that level of control is what is going to cause so much heartburn for the model of independent contractors and outsourcing risk and outsourcing liability. But every carrier that looks at California and says that is an aberration, that is not what we will see in the future, they are wrong. That is likely the case in most states already. They just don't know it. The difference between California and the rest of the country is something like the Private Attorneys General Act, which allows private lawyers, private litigants, to sue on behalf of the state of California to enforce labor code violations. And that, if that pendulum shifts, that could be a massive amount of liability and risk for every single trucking company in the business.
One of the things that you mentioned when we talked about AB5 earlier was the way that it could be regulated by the employee as opposed to a government regulator or a government agency. How do you think that plays out, especially as other states take a look at this and go, wow, look at the power now the employee could possibly have in regulating this?
It's a great question because, here's the reality. When you're a hiring entity, you tell the person you're hiring you're a contractor or you're an employee. If you tell someone they're a contractor and they're like, this sounds great, I'm happy with this, they're not going to go fighting you or suing you. But the reality is, if you misclassify, that employee then has that pathway to go after you. And that's where the liability lies. So if you're happy as an independent, you're not going to lose your company. You're not going to lose your job. The reality is you can keep doing what you do. But it might be the case, based on the state that you live in, the state you're working in, that under that regulatory regime, you actually are an employee and just don't know it. But you can keep doing that as long as you want until you realize maybe you want some better control over your work schedule. You want to have different customers. You want to have different ways of doing business. Then you have the opportunity to kind of look at bridging out. But this AB5, and the idea that we can find some way to get around it over the next few years, it's not going to happen. The Supreme Court's not going to weigh in on this, as far as I can tell, because wage and hour stuff is at the state level. And that's where it's going to likely remain for the foreseeable future.
So, Thomas, as we look at this again from a carrier perspective, long-term way, do you see this as something that they are going to embrace as from a carrier perspective, or is this something they're going to just try to deal with?
You're gonna have to deal with it because if you're having these challenges and stuff, you're gonna have to adjust your hiring practices. Are all drivers now hired in California? You're gonna have to be employees. You're gonna have to change your benefits package. You have to change your rates. You have to change your pricing strategy, your legal strategy, everything, because it revolves around low-cost owner operators that you really don't have to pay as much because you don't have to do all those extra things that are so pesky. So, I mean, for large carriers, behavior is gonna switch. States that do not have that very strict enforcement of a contractor, you get away with this business as usual. States that do have it in place, you're gonna have to fundamentally change how you hire, your practices, and your business operations to kind of adjust it. Or you have to use technology and give them an actual load board to pick their own stuff so that you can say, I fulfilled the requirement that you're a contractor.
Gotcha. Matt, real quick, do you see lawyers making a bunch of money off of this?
It's going to be a lot of money for lawyers, and that really warms my heart because the plaintiff lawyers will be out there trying to find ways to help their client, and the defense attorneys will out there saying, no, we need to make sure we proactively go after this. What I will say for every single company is you preventatively maintain your trucks. You do PMs all the time, but do you do preventative maintenance on your business and the legal documents that are the foundation of your company?
Right.
Every 6 months, at a minimum every year, go to your lawyer, ask them for advice, and make sure you're compliant in all the places that you do business. Otherwise, you will be tagged by a lawyer, not me, but someone else maybe, who will say you are going to pay some massive penalties and you don't have insurance to cover it.
Yeah.
That is not a good outcome for anybody.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how things bevel on out from here with with the new regulations, and of course the way that we're going to be hiring and the way that we're going to be doing business in trucking, especially in California, but in the rest of the nation as well. Thank you both for joining us. We'll take a short break and we'll come back with more after this.